As a child, I felt as though the world was solid, real. Of course, I believed there were certainly crevices where nightmares resided. The grown-ups around me told me the edges were secure, nothing was hiding under my bed. The universe was both large and not too large. It was strange, but not dangerous. The one afternoon after school, I watched a news program of the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, Geneva, running its first tests. I didn't understand the science behind it, of course. I simply remembered hearing this one sentence. There's a chance it can create a black hole. And that was enough. The world I believed I understood, the well-lit, comfortable world, began to crack. I fell asleep that night, thinking about the gravitational pull of an unseen point, small but invincible and swallowing everything in its path. I imagined the earth collapsing upon itself like a sheet of paper. I imagined waking up the next morning and there being nothing. I was legitimately upset about it for a considerable amount of time, little to soothe me. My father said, "There's no way that can happen." However, the damage was done. I had seen a true, far too large for me, a vast, cosmic, uncaring thing. And regardless of whether the possibility of the danger was real, the revelation was. Strange as it may seem to look back on now, something so scientifically based has such a mythic quality to it. Years passed since I first learned about the LHC, a life filled in the holes of my existence with the mundane things of life. School, friends, girls, half-remembered nights out, homework I did not complete. However, that memory still exists within me, the feeling of the ground beneath my feet giving away, and the flow of my perception of reality disappearing. Then years later, while I rummaging through a flea market, I stumbled upon a strange-looking case of a video game I'd never seen before. I'd never even heard about it. The core art was quite plain, and was too plain to be unnerving. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, and I didn't know at the time that playing this game allowed me to experience that same feeling I had as a kid, of learning something I wasn't supposed to, again. The 2002 release of Nintendo's M-rated psychological horror game, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem on the GameCube was a big deal in a lot of ways, especially since it was a major departure from what most fans expected from Nintendo. While it did not fare well in terms of sales, or even appear much in best-of lists outside of die-hard fan communities, however, for those players that were able to experience the horror game, Eternal Darkness was different. In fact, it was stranger and had a larger scope than other horror games at the time of its release. While many horror games have traditionally used limited environments such as hallways and direct threat-based gameplay, Eternal Darkness expanded its viewpoint over 2,000 years of human history. Ultimately, Eternal Darkness' storytelling style became a form of multi-generational haunting, where 4 cosmic deities and a large number of unfortunate humans are trapped in the middle of the battle between good and evil. Alexandra Rivas is at the center of the narrative and travels to her family's mansion in Rhode Island after the sudden, violent and inexplicable death of her grandfather Edward. Upon searching the mansion, Alexandra finds a secret room, which houses a book bound in something frighteningly similar to human remains. This is the beginning of the game's central story element, the Tome of Eternal Darkness. Through the tome, Alexandra is transported through time and experiences the memories of people that lived thousands of years ago, that were also experiencing the same ancient evil. A Roman centurion in 36 BCE, a Persian swordsman, a Franciscan monk, a medieval nobleman, a colonial doctor, a field reporter during World War I, a Canadian firefighter working in the Gulf War era. Each of these individuals experienced their own unique and terrifying reality as they encountered the same evil forces. All of them were aware of a horrific and unexplainable truth, though none knew the larger cosmic battle that was taking place around them. There are 12 chapters in Eternal Darkness, each of which represents a separate tragedy. Some of the characters that experience the horror of the ancient evil will live long enough to realize that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, while other characters will die completely unaware of the significant part they played in the cosmic battle. However, each of the 12 chapters provides something to future generations of characters, whether it is an object, a spell, knowledge, etc., that will allow them to continue to resist and fight back against the ancient evil. The mansion itself becomes a type of archaeological site, filled with accumulated evidence of trauma and resistance. But behind all of this lies the four ancient deities that have manipulated the course of human history to bring about their return. Ulya-Of, the god of magic and symmetry; Chaturga, the brute force of physical dominance; Xel-Lotav, the whispering god of madness; and the mysterious fourth deity, Mantorok, the corpse god, whose sole purpose appears to be to prevent the return of Ulya-Of and Chaturga by keeping Xel-Lotav occupied. Ultimately, the plan of the ancient deities is centered around a single human being, Pius Augustus, the Roman soldier from the first chapter who was corrupted by the powers of the ancient deities and serves as the unwitting puppet throughout the next 2000 years. As the story finally returns to Alexandra in the present, she has inherited not only a mention in the mystery, but the entirety of history as well. With each failure of previous characters, each incomplete ride, and each half-remembered revelation, Alexandra has been built upon. The past becomes the arsenal, the tome becomes the guide, and the mansion becomes the last battleground in a war that began thousands of years ago. In this manner, the resulting narrative forms a type of palimpsest. In a palimpsest, an author writes over another author, layer upon layer, until each generation has worn down the edge of the truth, to the point of no longer being able to fully comprehend it. It evokes the uneasy feeling that some conflicts exist prior to our arrival and continue beyond our departure. The game's most well-known innovation is the Sanity system, a mechanism intended to describe what occurs to a human brain when it comes into contact with the unattainable. When the player characters in Eternal Darkness experience something they should not have seen, player sanity begins to drain. As a result, the environment begins to cease behaving in a rational manner, walls bleed, the camera tilts, and your character's head appears to fall off. At first, these events seem to be typical horror devices, unsettling yet controlled. However, Eternal Darkness doesn't remain controlled for long. Eventually, the game begins to direct its focus outwards, toward you. The TV input seems to change. The volume control appears to close itself off. The game will simulate a crash. The game will pretend to lead your memory. The game will pretend no controller is connected. These are not jump scare events. They are slow, creeping incursions created to elicit the same feelings that the player's characters experience. A growing realization that the world around you may not be completely dependable. The longer you play, the more you will realize that the game is attempting to disturb you, rather than simply frightening you, attempting to create doubt regarding the framework you thought was stable. The rituals you learn during the course of the story enforce this theme. Each spell in Eternal Darkness consists of runes, abstract representations of concepts such as flesh, mind, space, protection, and corruption. When the runes are combined in the correct sequence, the world responds. A locked door opens, the creature is vanquished. Time stretches sufficiently to keep you alive. The game uses language as circuitry. If you can comprehend the arrangement of the runes, you can manipulate the universe. However, with every new spell you learn, you're also taking a further step into a greater, older logic, one that precedes humanity, and doesn't particularly concern itself with whether you understand it or not. Power, mastery, and corruption are indistinguishable. The more powerful a tome makes you, the more your use of it compromises you. Ultimately, the game represents a philosophical structure in which knowledge functions as both a light source and a flammable material. Learning anything in Eternal Darkness is always non-neutral. It alters you, either gradually or violently, due to the fact that the truths you uncover are too large, too alien, and too antagonistic to the ways by which humans typically interpret the world. The game treats revelation the way ancient mystics treat divine encounters, not as an enlightening experience, but as a form of disassembling. The more you understand, the more the boundaries of reality disintegrates. The boundaries between worlds grows thinner, and the membrane that separates your thoughts from something vast and deliberate begins to deteriorate. This is a concept a man I will introduce you to now was concerned with well over his entire career. Arthur Machen was born in 1863 in the town of Caerleon, Monmouthshire, Wales. He was raised within the family of an Anglican cleric and thus grew up in the borderland area between England and Wales. In Wales, Machen became fascinated with ancient ruins, Roman roads and Celtic mythology, all of which would eventually be reflected in his fiction. Although he did not have a large amount of money, Machen had a solid classical education and moved to London in the 1880s, where he worked at several different occupations, such as a translator, writer, journalist and an actor before focusing on fiction writing. As a result of his background of being exposed to mystical and occult literature throughout his life, much of Machen's early writing, including his translations of alchemical texts, reflect his ongoing interest in the occult and mystical. As author during Britain's third siècle period of decadence and spiritual disillusionment, Machen's first major work, the 1894 novella The Great God Pan, provoked both outrage and admiration due to its blending of elements of Gothic horror, eroticism, and cosmic fear. The story follows the consequences of a botched attempt at a medical experiment, in which a female patient undergoes a brain operation that enables her to see behind the curtain of normal reality to an alternate, malevolent world. Each consequence that arises from this new vision escalates into greater horrors, are increasingly unexplainable and end in self-destruction, madness, and random, unexplained deaths. Initially rejected by critics for its obscenity, the work is now recognized as one of the key works of the weird fiction genre and considered a seminal text in the horror genre. In his subsequent writings, particularly in The White People from 1899, Machen further explores some of the recurring ideas and motifs he established in his earlier works: the boundaries of human perception, the risks associated with acquiring forbidden knowledge, the fine line separating everyday reality and metaphysical horror. The White People is presented as a fragmentary diary of a young girl who is introduced to a mystical tradition that is kept secret from the rest of society. The diary is told by two men who debate the nature of sin, and the story emphasizes that evil and innocence are not mutually exclusive, but rather can coexist in the same domain of existence through Gnostic awareness and ritual practice. Through his entire body of work, Machen consistently links the pursuit of knowledge, especially forbidden or sacred knowledge, with the potential for permanent psychological and spiritual damage. His literary works stem from an unusual blend of spiritual influences. Machen's work was influenced by Christian mysticism, specifically the sacramental view of the world of Catholics, in which every object could contain a divine presence. At the same time, Machen was also influenced by older pre-Christian forms of spirituality, paganism, Gnosticism, and alchemy. This blend created a worldview in which the beautiful, the divine, and the terrifying were never clearly distinguishable from each other. Horror for Machen was not the product of monsters or gore, but rather from transcendence, from those few moments in which something bursts to the surface of reality and changes or ruins someone who has witnessed it. Like many of his contemporaries, however, Machen did not dismiss the possibility of the supernatural. Machen feared the supernatural precisely because he believed in it. To Machen, the spiritual world was not a metaphor, it was a proximity issue. The spiritual world was too close, too powerful, and too capable of disrupting the fragile, rational frameworks people create to understand their lives. Machen's impact was largely obscured during his time on Earth, and after death eclipsed by other writers who were commercially more popular than he was, further by H.P. Lovecraft, who oddly enough admired Machen greatly. In his book Supernatural Horror and Literature, Lovecraft refers to Machen as one of the true masters of cosmic dread. Further, many of the themes used by Lovecraft, like the concept of forbidden knowledge, the feeling of an inherited fate, the understanding that the universe is both unknowable and hostile to human comprehension, can be found within Machen's works. While Machen did not create these ideas, he formulated them into something distinctly his own. The reason Machen has been somewhat obscure is due to the fact that the mystical structure that supports much of his writing fell from favor in the literary community that favored skepticism. However, in the realm of horror, where the irrational and the strange thrive, Machen's impact has endured. To Machen, existence is a form of sacrament. In the most primal sense of the term, which means the physical world is a thin membrane overlaying profound, old and often terrifying spiritual realities. To Machen, the sacred is neither comforting, nor moral, nor reassuring. An experience with the divine does not affirm what a person believes. It annihilates the self that believes it. Further, Machen's characters are rarely prophets or mystics. Instead, they are ordinary individuals, such as clergymen, physicians, and scholars, who inadvertently uncover something that should remain hidden. What they discover is not simply paranormal, but also metaphysically disorienting. All of the above leads to Machen's definition of hierophany, Religious historian and philosopher Mircea Eliade created the term hierophany to represent those events in which a sacred breaks the ordinary world, thereby creating moments where the divine intersects with the mundane. As seen by Eliade, hierophanies create a disruption to reveal a larger plan of meaning that underlies our day-to-day lives, a hierarchical framework of understanding that transcends the tangible and allows us to grasp the intangible. These disruptions can take many forms, including a sacred rock, rituals, and mythological events, all representing points in time where the divine intersects with the mundane world and provides clarity to the chaos that surrounds us. While Arthur Machen retains the concept of the hierophany, he dramatically alters the way the concept will be perceived emotionally. For Machen, a hierophany represents a confrontation with something that is far more real and impossible for the human mind to comprehend. In fact, because it is so immense, it creates a fear that is based upon the sheer magnitude of the experience, rather than the malevolent intentions of the divine. Machen's sacred is also not evil nor is it cruel. Rather, Machen's sacred is simply indifferent to humanity. It does not attempt to teach humanity any moral lessons, but instead teaches humanity of its own insignificance. What exists beyond the world that we can see in Machen's stories is a metaphysical structure that is so massive that the human mind can collapse when it is required to perceive it. Therefore, Machen's sacred is as frightening as it's awe-inspiring. Machen's sacred is an answer to human suffering. Instead, it is a force that renders human suffering irrelevant. Those who witness a hierophany typically do not emerge from the experience unchanged. Instead, they either die, lose their minds, or become someone that the world can no longer recognize as human. Machen's horror is therefore not about monsters entering the world of humans, but rather about the world of humans intruding into the illusions that make up the world that we know. When I reflect on me as that young boy and his reaction to the Hadron Collider's experiments, the fear I felt as he realized the universe is larger than he'd been led to believe, and larger than he could contain. I remember the physical sensation of the fear, the quickness of breath, the sudden dawning of realization that we humans could be so arrogant that we in our arrogance would literally consume everything around us with a black hole. I do not have this same fear today. I didn't necessarily become braver, but I've come to learn a disturbing fact. Within my and possibly many lifetimes, we're going to be too weak to create anything close to that. We're small and we're fragile. We're simply scraping sparks off the surface of reality and calling them advancements. However, we do not have control of the deeper workings of reality. But still, the universe has black holes. They're not here, not in a lab, and not in visible reach of our blue marble, but they're elsewhere, ripping stars apart at places I'll never see or imagine, revealing truths outside of our view, outside of our ability to comprehend, uninterested in whether we take notice or not. That's where the word hierophany finally makes sense to me at the moment the universe shows you a truth you were never built to hold. A revelation so vast it becomes its own kind of horror. Not necessarily that we could potentially harm the Earth with our science, which is a reality, but that the Earth is a part of a universe large enough to annihilate us without ever having known our name. It's a type of knowledge that provides no solace. It does nothing for your protection, it merely expands the expanse of the universe until you feel the weight of the distance and its uncaring vastness in your very bones. Because in relation and in comparison, we all, with all our history and our worries, nothing more than a speck of dust in a hurricane.